Okay. Okay, recording is going. Okay, so, and I guess we should start, and maybe as I'm doing my introduction, maybe one or two more people will join. So again, welcome back to the latest in the series of iNetSoft training webinars for Style Intelligence. My name is David Fass. I think everyone online right now knows who I am, but I'm the trainer at iNetSoft, and we've been doing these monthly training episodes. And I'll go through the same spiel that I always do, which is to tell you that everybody is muted currently, so I cannot hear you if you try to talk to me, so just be aware of that. However, I am happy to take any questions, so please, if you have a question during the webinar or when I'm wrapping up the webinar, feel free to type in the chat box or type in the question box, whatever interface you have there, and I'll see that pop up on my screen, and I'll try to answer as soon as I see it. And of course, if you have questions after the training, you can always feel free to email me any questions. My email is david.fass@inetsoft.com. Okay, so today's episode, and I think this should be a pretty short one. I know I always say that, but I think it will be in this case. So the topic today is grouping and aggregating data in data worksheets. All right, so it's pretty basic. Grouping and aggregation is something that you frequently need to do. But before we get to the couple examples that I have, just to illustrate how it's done in a data worksheet, let me close that, and hopefully everybody can see my screen. I have Visual Composer open here, full screen. The first thing that I want to point out before we get to doing stuff in a data worksheet is that a lot of grouping and aggregation you can do in a dashboard, and you don't need to do it in the data worksheet. So just as an example, I'll just create a blank dashboard here, a blank view sheet, new view sheet based on one of our sample data worksheets, right? So in terms of grouping and aggregation, you can do that quite easily in a chart or in a crosstab within the dashboard. So if I just throw a chart into a dashboard here, and let's say I want to group some data, let's say by category. Right? I want to group by category, and I want to for each category I want to aggregate the let's say the average quantity purchased for each category. Right? I can just create a chart like this with category on the x-axis, quantity purchased on the y-axis. I can set the aggregation method to something like average, and actually it's pretty even across all categories, so that's not actually that illuminating. But you can see that basically I can do this kind of grouping and aggregation very trivially within a chart and a dashboard. Same thing for a crosstab. I could easily create a crosstab in a dashboard that would allow me to do grouping and aggregation. I could make almost the same thing in a crosstab. I could have a category as a row header, maybe throw in the year as the date field here as the column header. That'll break it out by years by default, and throw in a measure, either a quantity purchased or total. And again, crosstab in a dashboard does grouping and aggregation, and what I've done here is I've done grouping by category as well as by year, and for each combination of category and year I've aggregated the totals. Right? So so when you're thinking about doing grouping and aggregation, you don't immediately need to think about doing some kind of work in a data worksheet at the data level. A lot, perhaps even most grouping and aggregation you can do very simply within a dashboard. And you can even do grouping and aggregation not within a chart or within a crosstab. You can also do it by creating calculated fields at the dashboard level. So if you wanted to create a new field that was a grouping field or an aggregated field, you could right-click on your data source in your dashboard. Right? In this case, it's the data block in a data worksheet that is our data source here. And you could select new calculated field, and this would allow you to create an aggregated field. I believe we discussed this in a previous webinar, so I'm not going to go into it now. My only point here before getting started with the actual examples that I plan to do is just that if you're in a situation where you have data that you need to represent in grouped and aggregated form, probably your first thought should be just to do it in the dashboard. In other words, just create the dashboard based on whatever data source you already have set up, and probably the tools within the dashboard will be adequate in most cases to allow you to do the grouping and aggregation that you need to do in a very straightforward manner. In some cases, however, you do need to do grouping and aggregation at the data level, and that's what we're going to look at now. One instance where you might need to do that is if, for example, you want to create a grouped field, a grouping field, or an aggregated value, and you want that to be available to every, all the dashboards that people are making. So let's say you've got a set of dashboard developers. They might even be end users, maybe not very technical, and so you want to give them all of the fields that they need. And among the fields that you want to provide to them in their data source, you want to provide some grouped fields or aggregated fields, right? So in that case, and that way they would not need to worry about doing that at the dashboard level. In that case, you can add or create those fields at the data level in the data worksheet, right? So there are instances where you may find yourself in a situation where you need to create grouped and aggregated fields at the data level in the data worksheet. So let's leave aside the dashboard, and we'll now take a look at how you do that in a data worksheet. And we'll start simple and just add a little bit of complexity, but not too much. So I'm going to create a new data worksheet by pressing the new worksheet button at the top. And probably most of you know what a worksheet is. It's basically a tool for mashing up data, either mashing up data from different data sources or doing a variety of different operations on existing data, such as grouping and filtering, creating expressions, expression columns, and so on and so forth. So what we'll look at is just the basics of doing grouping and aggregation. So I'm going to add a very simple data block into this new worksheet, and I'll just find in our sample data sources here, there's a query called all sales. Right, so if you have a default, sample evaluation installation or a basic installation, this is the set of sample queries that get installed by default. So there is one called all sales, and it's pretty simple. I'm just going to drag the whole query into the data worksheet and put it into live preview mode in the data worksheet. And so this is the data. So effectively, this is a query that's running on, gets sent to the database, and it comes back with this data. And now I've got this represented in my data worksheet, and I can do all kinds of stuff with it, such as from the toolbar here, filtering, grouping, sorting, expression column, as well as other things in addition. So what I want to do here is just to illustrate how, within a data worksheet, how I would group and aggregate this data. Okay. So obviously the thing that I would do here for basic grouping and aggregation is I would press the group and aggregate button. Right, that's right over here. There's probably some way I can turn on highlighting. Let me just see if I could turn on spotlight. Does that help? Probably not. Okay, I'm just going to go back to my normal cursor here. That's a highlighter. Okay. Okay, it's too much technology. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my regular pointer, and hopefully you can see that I'm pointing at the group and aggregate button. You press that button, and it gives you a very simple interface that allows you to group and aggregate the data in this data block, right, the data in this query. And so, for example, a very simple grouping would be, let's say, group by employee, right? So I select employee from the top menu here, and you can see that because that's a string field, the data in there is a string data, it assumes that that is going to be a grouping field. And then if for each employee, if I want to compute the aggregated total, right, the total sales for that employee, I would select the total field here. Because the total field is a numerical field, it assumes that I want to aggregate that. Of course, it does not guess correctly in every instance, so sometimes you may need to check whether it's correctly identifying a field as a grouping field or as an aggregate field and switch it appropriately. And then from the right side over here, for the aggregate field, you select what method of aggregation you want. Do you want it to sum up the totals for each employee, or average the totals for each employee, take them in, take the max, and so on and so forth. So in this case, I'll just leave it as sum. Right, so this is kind of the most basic grouping and aggregation that you could do. One grouping field, one aggregate field, press OK. Right, and basically what you've done is you've grouped and aggregated this data, so now you've just got the 4 groups. There are only 4 sales employees in our data set, so you get one group corresponding to each employee, Annie, Eric, Robert, and Sue, and the sum total sales for each employee. So that's basic grouping and aggregation. Now what you'll notice here is that all the other fields, there were 3 other fields in this data block right? 3 other fields being returned by this query originally. Now that we've applied this grouping and aggregation, this data block only returns 2 fields. It only returns the fields that are either grouping fields or aggregation fields, right? And that's the way it works, right? So this data set that we're now retrieving is going to give us just these values that you see here. Those other 3 columns are no longer being returned in this data set, right? And we'll see in the last example that I'm going to do, we'll see how you can handle a situation where you want both the grouping information as well as the original detail information, right? So let's say, that you're in a situation where for your dashboard designers or your report designers, you want to give them not only this grouped information that we see here, but also, if I can just, well, let me just undo. Right? You want to give them also this original detail information, and you want to give them all of that within a single data set, within a single data block. I'll show you how to handle that situation in a bit. Anyway, let me redo the grouping. And what I want to show you here is that there are several different views when you have a grouped data block like this. So if you go to the Change View button, which is the rightmost button in the title bar, and you press that, you can see that there are a few choices here. In fact, I was expecting to see one more, but can't remember what the other one was. But anyway, there's a default view, right? So if you switch to the default view, it's basically a metadata view. It shows you the columns that are being retrieved in the data set, right? The columns that are being returned by this data block, and it just shows you the metadata, right? The data type XXX means string, 999 means numerical, right? And so this view is sometimes useful in the event that the amount of data being processed is very large, and if that's the case, then sometimes the live preview view might take too long to generate, right? So if you have a lot of data blocks and they're all in live preview, then obviously what it needs to do is it's actually running the queries on the database to retrieve this data. Sometimes if those queries, the queries represented by these data blocks, actually take some amount of time to run on the database, you might prefer not to have these data blocks in live preview, right? Because it might take a few seconds every time you do an operation or something for the queries to re-execute and so on. So that's when the default view comes in handy, because then in the default view, it doesn't need to run the queries on the database. It just, it's just showing you the metadata. The other views here are the full view. Full view is basically the metadata view, but it also shows you the columns which were originally there from the ungrouped data that are no longer being returned, and it shows them grayed out, right? So you can see order number, company order date. It's there for your information, but the fact that they're grayed out indicates that those are not being returned in the actual result set. And if you want to confirm that, you can, if you click on the data block and preview the data block, either by clicking the preview button in the toolbar or right-clicking and selecting preview, you can see that the only data that's actually being returned by this data block is the grouped data, the grouped and aggregated columns. Okay, but nevertheless, the full view, it lets you see what was there originally and would be there again if you ungroup the data block. The other view that you see there is the detail preview, which basically previews, it's essentially the live preview, but with the columns that are hidden, right, with the ungrouped columns. So this shows you all of the data that would be there if you did not have the grouping and aggregation on this data block. Right? So those are the different views that you have for a grouped and aggregated data block, and probably most of the time you would either keep it in default view or in live preview. Okay, so that's basic grouping and aggregation. Of course, you can do more elaborate grouping and aggregation with multiple grouping fields and multiple aggregation fields. That's very simple. You just press the group and aggregate button again, right? That takes you back to the group and aggregate dialog box. And if you want, you could add another grouping field. For example, in addition to grouping by employee, we might want to group by order date. Right, so it doesn't matter what order, incidentally, you specify these in. So the fact that I have a grouping field here in the first menu and then an aggregate field in the second menu and then another grouping field in the third menu, that doesn't really matter because it's the order here is not significant in any way. So I'm going to group additionally by order date, and you can see that for a date field in the right menu, you can actually choose the grouping level. So I might choose that I want to group by year, which is the generally the default for date fields. Whenever you're grouping a date field, the default grouping level is always year, but you can change that, for example, to month or week or quarter. Sorry, I had something pop up on my screen here. So I'll set it to year, meaning that I want to group by year in addition to grouping by employee, and I'll add another aggregate field. Let's say I'll aggregate also not only the total, but also I'll count up the order numbers. So I'll select the order number field and switch the aggregation method to count. Right? It's basically going to count for each group, for each subgroup, which is now a subgroup corresponding to a particular employee and a particular year. Right? Employee and year, I'm going to count up the number of orders by that employee in that year. Right? So two grouping fields, two aggregate fields. Then I can press OK. Right? And this is the result that I get. Now this, again, this is in live preview, and you can see that I've got it grouped both by employee over here. Right? So here's Annie's group. And there are 4 years in our data set, 2013 through 2016. So I've got those subgroups, all 4 years for Annie, then all 4 years for Eric, all 4 years for Robert. And for each of those subgroups, I've got then the count of order numbers, right? Basically how many orders that salesperson had in that particular year, and the dollar amount total. Right? So another very basic illustration of grouping and aggregation. Okay. Now let's take, and again, if there's any questions, I know this is pretty basic, but if you do have a question, feel free to type in the chat box. I'll try to answer. Let's take a little variation on this and just illustrate how you can control the grouping in a manual fashion. And basically what I mean is that by default, when you specify grouping, for example, grouping on the employee field, every individual value in that field is going to define a group, right? So in the employee field in our data set, right, where the data is coming from, there are 4 employees, 4 salespeople, and so each of those salespeople becomes a group, right? Annie becomes a group, Eric becomes a group, Robert becomes a group, and so on. In some cases, you may want to define the grouping at a different level of granularity. For example, what popped into my mind based on the data that we have is that we might choose to create a group for men and a group for women, right? Instead of having each salesperson be their own group, maybe what's interesting to us is for reasons that that I can't really think of. What's interesting for us is to compare the sales of the men, which are Eric and Robert, to the sales of the women, Annie and Sue. Right. So how would we do that? Right. So we don't. And there's a couple of different ways we could do that. One way we could do it is we could create an expression field. Right. There's actually we would have to create a mirror of this table first. But if we created a mirror of this. Right, because I don't see the expression option here, but if I create a mirror, right, then I do see this expression field here, create expression. What I could do is I could create a new column, and that new column would have a value of either men or women, depending. I could write some scripted logic that would look at the employee name and return either men or women in that column, and then I could do the grouping on that column. That would be one conceivable approach to doing this. But what I wanted to show you is that there's another mechanism which is called a user-defined group that also allows you to do that kind of thing, where you want to do the grouping at a different level of granularity. All right, and so what you do is you go up to this new object button in the toolbar, click on that guy, and there's an option there called grouping. Right, and if you read the little description that pops up, it says create a new user-defined grouping for worksheets and reports. Right, so if you click on that, right, it opens up this dialog box, and you can give a name to this new grouping, and I'll just call it gender. Right, that's the name of this grouping object that I'm creating. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a set of conditions that determines for the field that I'm interested in whether the values in that field go into one group or into another group. Right, and you can have as many different groups as you want, but in this case it's just going to be 2, men and women. So there's one choice that you have to make here, and that is whether you want this grouping to be defined based on the data type, right? In which case you would select the data type here, right? So what I could do is I could create this grouping object and have it be available for any field of type string, for example, right? And in that case, I could apply this grouping to any column in the data set that had type string, whether or not it made sense or not, right? So, if I select the string option, then when I create this grouping, I can use this grouping for a field like employee that actually has, different employees, but I could also use it on a field like category, because the category field is also a string field. But it wouldn't really make any sense because, categories don't have gender, right? So in that instance, if I choose to do this, then, it creates a little bit, I have to use it carefully, right? I would only want to use the grouping for fields where it makes sense to use that grouping, even though technically it would be available for any column of type string. The other option here is not to do that, but rather to define the grouping only for a particular column. Right? And if you want to take that approach, what you do is you first of all select the data set that you want the grouping, this user-defined grouping, to be available for. And so what I would do is I would select the all sales query. Right? This data block that we have here is just the all sales query. It's I just drag the all sales query in here, so that's the data set that I want this grouping to be available for. Right? So I select all sales, and then I would select the column of that particular query for which I want this user-defined grouping to be available, right? And that would obviously be the employee column, right? And what that means, if I set it up this way, that means that this user-defined grouping can only be applied to that particular column, right? It can't be applied to any other, string type column in any other data set. It has to be applied to the employee column of the all sales query. Right, so that's a choice that you have, whether you want it to be generally available for any column of the appropriate data type, or whether you want to limit it just to a particular column in a particular data set. So that's what I'll do in this case. I'm going to limit it just to apply to the employee column of the all sales query. And then what you do is you define your conditions. So you press the add button at the bottom, and my first group is going to be called men. And the condition that defines whether somebody is a man or not is going to be pretty simple. In this case, right, I only have one choice here because I've defined this named grouping based on the employee column. So whatever logic I write is going to have to be based off that particular column. So employee is one of, and if I click this browse data button, right, it looks into that field and it knows that there are just 4 distinct values in that field. So I'll say Eric or Robert. Right, so that's the condition that determines whether a value is in the group called men. Right, if employee is one of Eric or Robert. Right, then press OK. Right, so I've got that condition defined, and then I'm going to add a second condition, which I'll call women. And pretty obvious what this is going to be: one of Annie or Sue. Okay, so this is my user-defined grouping, and basically what I'm doing here is I'm saying that when I do a grouping on the employee field, I want to have the option not only to create a group for each individual employee, but also to create the grouping at a higher level, a more general level where the values are grouped as either men or women. Right, so that's a user-defined grouping. There's one other option here, which is in the event that there are values in that field which are not captured by the conditions that you specified, what do you want to do with those other values? You can either group all those orphan values together into a single group called others, or you can let each of those orphan values exist as its own group. Right. In this case, there are no orphan values because we've basically covered the entire universe here. Right. There are only 4 salespeople, and they're each going to fall into one of these 2 categories. But in a moment, we'll come back and we'll see how those other options work. So I'll press OK, and that creates this new named grouping or user-defined grouping, and it exists as an independent asset. You can see here right now it's not associated with our data set in any way. It's just an independent asset, and in fact, if you make this the primary asset in the data worksheet, right? If you right-click on it and do Set as Primary, and if you save this data worksheet, then you can actually use this this user-defined grouping in other worksheets and also in reports for doing grouping. So if you have another data worksheet where you're going to do the same kind of grouping on an employee field in that data worksheet, or if you're creating a report, or I don't think it applies to dashboards actually, I'd have to check. You can use, if you save this data worksheet with the user-defined grouping object as the primary object, then you can use that also in reports and in other worksheets. In this case, we won't, though. We're just going to use it for this this data block over here. So what we'll do is we'll go back up to the grouping dialog box for the data block, press the group and aggregate button, right? And what I want to do is for the employee field, rather than having each employee define their own group, what I want to do is come over here to this right menu, and now I can select the gender user-defined grouping, right? That's what we just made, this user-defined grouping or named grouping, right? I can select that, and by selecting that, basically what I'm doing is I'm instructing the grouping, instead of to group each individual employee into its own group, to use the gender grouping to represent that group. So in other words, rather than having each employee individually, I just want to see men and women as the groups, right? So that's how you do it. You press OK, right? And then we get pretty much what we expect, which is that we're going to have a grouping by men and women. So now, rather than having each combination of each employee and each year, we've got every combination of men and women with each year, right? So men 2013, men 2014, women 2013, 2014, and so on. Right, so that's how you create a user-defined grouping. Again, it's not the only way to create this result. Again, what you could have done conceivably is to create, to create an expression column that also, groups the employees into men and women, and then group on that expression column. But this is one way to do it, and it's a reusable way to do it, right? If for whatever reason, if you're going to be doing that kind of grouping at that level repeatedly in different worksheets or in different reports, you can create this kind of asset, this user-defined grouping, and then reuse it in many worksheets and in many reports and so on. Okay, let's just take a look at how the orphans are handled when you have orphan values. So I'll just go back in here. To get back into this editor, what you do is you right-click on the user-defined grouping and select Properties. And I'm just going to start over. Right, so again, I'll select All Sales, Employee, and this time I'm just going to add 1/2 of the conditions that we had before. I'll just have the, let's say, the women side of things. All right, so it's the same condition as before, Annie and Sue. Okay, so there's the Annie and Sue are going to fall into this category, this group called women, and that I'm going to leave it like that, right, and just see what happens. And so for starters, I'm going to leave this option called Group All Others Together, leave that one enabled, and see what the result is. So press OK. All right, what you can see is that we'd still have this category called Women, same as before, but now there's a category called Others. And basically what's happening here is that the men, basically all the values that are not being grouped in this new group called Women, the two men are falling into a default category called Others. So now we have Women and Others. Right? So that's what happens when you choose to lump the orphan values together into a single default group. Let's take a look at the other option. I think it'll give me an error if I just switch them. Yeah, there's a slight bug here. I just need to reselect the original query, and I'm going to also redefine the women's group here. Try to spell it right. No, I'll just use the autocomplete. Okay. Employee is one of our two women. Okay, so we're back here. We've got the women being grouped into this category called Women, and now we're going to test out this other option called Leave Others in Their Own Group. You could probably guess what it does if I press OK. Basically, we're going to still have this category called Women, but the men who are not, these are the orphan values, which are not being explicitly grouped. They each basically fall into their own group. Eric gets his own group. Robert gets his own group. And that's the result. So, again, depending on the application, you can decide how you want to handle those orphan values that are not explicitly being grouped. Okay, so that's the concept of a named grouping or user-defined grouping. Okay, let's move on, and we'll take a look at. I'm going to delete this. Let me blow away the grouping that we have here. I'll just clear that out. Press OK, and then I can delete this. Incidentally, just to illustrate, if you did want to reuse this grouping in another data worksheet, right? So again, what you would do is you would set it as the primary, set it as the primary asset, and then save the worksheet. All right, so I press the save button, and I'll call it, I'll just call it maybe gender group or something. You'd save the worksheet, and then let's say you want to use that in another worksheet when that actually finishes saving. So now if I take a look, I should be able to find that if I go to global worksheet. All right, so you can see here now I save that, this gender group worksheet, it's actually identified with a grouping symbol indicating that the primary component in the worksheet is a grouping asset. So what I would do then to use this is I would, if I wanted to use it in another worksheet, I would create a different worksheet, and let's say I have another worksheet with essentially the same data source, which was the all sales query. Right, so here's a new worksheet, and let's say that I wanted to use that user-defined grouping in this worksheet. What I would do is I would drag it in, right, from the asset panel here. Right, so I'd find it among my global worksheets. There's the gender group. I would drag it in here, right, and so now this can be used within this other worksheet. Right, so there it is. And then if I want to group this guy, I could go ahead, group an aggregate. I could group employee, and I'd be able to select the gender grouping, that user-defined grouping that we had created in the other worksheet, right? Because I drag it in here, I can reuse it here, right? So that's how you would use it. In a report or in a dashboard, I'll check. I guess I'll check at the end whether you could actually use it in a dashboard. I'm not 100% sure, well, let me just check real quick. Can I use that in a dashboard? Let me create a dashboard. Let's see. I'll just check this really quick. If I create a dashboard based on that query, so I'm just going to check really quick if I have a crosstab in this dashboard. Can I use that grouping field? I don't think I can. Yeah, there's not, in a dashboard you don't really have access to that user-defined grouping as far as I can tell. Yeah, so but in a report you do. Okay, so let me just get, that was a little bit off the track. Okay, so so that's how you would use this grouping that you defined in a data worksheet within another data worksheet. Okay, so I'm back out of there. Okay. So the next thing that I want to show you is that when you're doing grouping and aggregation in a data worksheet, you also have the option to create a crosstab. It's part of the grouping and aggregate dialog box, which you may have seen. So I'm going to delete this, and if we go back to our data set here, which is now back, there's no grouping on this now. It's an ungrouped data set, ungrouped data block. You may have noticed down at the bottom left corner here that there's a switch to crosstab. Switch to crosstab option. You press that, and it changes the dialog box so that you can now use this to set up a crosstab. Now, of course, you can also do a crosstab in a dashboard or a report. You don't, if you're thinking of getting your data into a crosstab format, you don't have to do it in the data worksheet. And in fact, it's probably easier, unless there's some compelling reason, it's probably easier just to create the crosstab. If that's, the crosstab, if that's what you're going for, just to create it in the dashboard or in the report based on the raw data in the data block, but you can do it here. And the way that you would do it is you would select row headers and column headers. For example, we could have employee as the row header. We could have the year as the column header, right? So again, for a date field, you can select the grouping level. For other fields, you can select, if there is a user-defined grouping, you can select the user-defined grouping here, but right now I deleted our gender grouping, so there is nothing else available other than the default grouping. For row headers, you can have multiple levels of grouping. So you could have a group by employee and also group by company, for example, and and additional fields as well. For the column header, you can only have one level of grouping as the column header. That's just a restriction. It's a limitation of crosstabs in the data worksheet. There is no such limitation when you're designing a crosstab in a dashboard or a report. When you're doing the crosstab there, you could have multiple column header levels as well as multiple row header levels. So that's one reason that you might choose to do it in the dashboard or report rather than at the data worksheet level. Anyway, you set up your row headers, you set up your column headers, you define your measures, or measure as the case may be. Here, just a single measure. Right. Again, it's another limitation of crosstab in a data worksheet is that you can select just one measure. In a report or in a dashboard, you can of course have multiple measures, as many as you want, and that's basically it. Then you press OK. Right, and that gives you the data back in a crosstab format. Right, so here we've got two levels of row header. Right, so employee and company, so it's grouping both on employee, grouping on company, and one level of column header, which is grouping by the year. Right, and then the aggregated data that we have is the aggregated totals for each subgroup, which is each combination of employee, company, and year. You see some blank cells. That means that for that combination of employee, company, and year, there were no sales. Right, so you just get a null value there. Right, so that's a pretty straightforward example of doing a crosstab in a data worksheet. Okay, so that's pretty much all the basic stuff, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask. What I want to show you just to wrap up is an example of how you would get a data set that includes both the original detail information and the grouped information, because what you'll notice is that, and what you probably have noticed, is that when you're doing this grouping and aggregation on a data block, you don't get, once you've done the grouping, you don't have the detail information anymore, right? So let me just go back to our most simple example here. The simple example that we originally had, switch it back to a regular table. And the original example that we had was just employee and total, right? Just like this, right? You can see that when you do the grouping, you only get the grouping and aggregate columns, right? You don't have the detail information anymore. But what about the situation where you want both the detail information and the grouping information in a single data block? Perhaps you want to display such a table in your dashboard, or perhaps you want to create a chart based off of that table that has both the grouped information and the detail information. What you would do is you would basically create a grouped data block and also keep the original detail data block and then join them together. Right, so let's do an example of that. So let me just make this a little bit more complex here. And I think what I'll do is I'll also group, let's also group this by, we'll leave the total as the aggregate field. So in addition to employee, we'll group by year, and we'll group by company. Let me just think if that makes sense. So this will give us a group, this will give us the totals for each employee in each year and for each company. Let me get rid of the company field. Whoops. So this then would give us the, yeah, maybe this makes more sense. So what I have here, the grouping that I'm setting up is that I'm going to group by employee and by year, and for each employee and year, I'll get the total. In fact, let me clear this for a moment. And what I'm going to do here, before I do that, this is the original. I'm back to the original data block here. What I want to do, I want to keep this detail data block, and what I'll do is I'll create a mirror of this that I can group. Right. So here's just to backtrack a little bit. Right here, I'm back to the original detail. It's the all sales query that I originally dragged in, just the detail information. All the orders listed there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a mirror of this that I can then group and aggregate. Right. So here's a mirror, is essentially a linked copy. Right. So this is a linked copy. It means that any changes that are made to the original here will be propagated to the mirror. Right. That's the concept of a mirror data block. And I'm going to do the grouping and aggregation here. And again, what I intend to do is just group by employee and Yeah, I'll group by employee and aggregate, group by employee and year and aggregate the totals for employee and year. Okay, so let's do that. Press the group and aggregate button and group by employee, aggregate by year, group by year and aggregate the totals. And in fact, maybe what I want to do is, let's say that, actually, let me back out of this also. I'm just trying to think of how to make this example a little bit more. Let me do a little bit. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a little bit of grouping on the original data block also. So I'm going to delete this. Sorry, I did have this example worked out previously, but now I'm recollecting the details of it. So I'm going back up here to the original detail data block. I'm going to do a little bit of grouping here, and I'm going to group this by month. Right. So what I'm going to have is employee, company, month, and total up here. So let me do a little grouping up here. Employee, company, group by month, right? Grouping the order date by month, right? So I've got 3 grouping fields: employee, company, order date, and then I'm going to have the sum totals, right? So for each employee, company, and month, I'll have the sum totals, right? So this is the data that I have up here, and then together with this data, what I want to additionally throw in here is the monthly average. So for each of these groups of employee and company, I want to average across all the months, right? So I want the monthly average for each combination of employee and company. Right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another data block with that that additional grouping. Right, so I'm going to create the mirror. Right, so here's my mirror, and in the mirror, what I'm going to do is I'm going to average across all the months for each employee and company. So again, another level of grouping here, and I'll group again by employee, group by company, and this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to average the totals. Okay. So what you can see is that in this second data block, because I'm only grouping on an employee and company, I'm not grouping on the date field anymore. What's going to happen is because I'm averaging the totals, right? All the months of data for a given employee and company are going to be averaged together. Those totals will be averaged. Okay, so I'll press OK. Right, and so this is the result. Now what I have here are combinations of employee and company, and for each employee and company, the average monthly sales across all of the months in our data set. Right? So my intention here now is that I want to create a single data block that has all of this data. In other words, I want to have the monthly sales, right, which is what I have from the top data block for each employee and company. I've got the sales in each month, May, June, July, etc. And what I want to include also in the data set is I want the average monthly total across all months, right, which I have in the second data block. So this is an example of where we want to combine data at 2 different levels of grouping. All right, and it would be the same procedure if you wanted to, if these were the raw detail records and you also wanted to combine in some group data, the same procedure. What we need to do is we need to join these 2 data blocks together and relate them appropriately on the employee and on the company field. Right? That means that for a given employee and company group, I want to make sure that the average monthly total is displayed next to that next to the proper employee and company. Right? So for Annie and Big Ed's BBQ, here's the monthly the average monthly sales. I want to make sure that that's displayed next to every instance where we have Annie and Big Ed's BBQ over here. So the way you do that is by setting up a join, and you can do that in a couple of different ways, either by using the join table button at the top and setting up the join, or perhaps an easier way is just to click and drag. Right? So I'm going to click the employee column here and drag it onto the employee column there to create the first join, meaning that I'm synchronizing on that column. Right? And then the second join, if I want to also synchronize the company columns here, I can just click company here and drag onto the company field there, and that creates a double join. right? So that's one way to do it. Basically, it takes all of the columns from these two data blocks, puts them into a single data block, and synchronizes the values in the employee column and in the company column. The other way to do that, perhaps the more formal way to do that, is to select the two data blocks, go up to Join Table, do Inner Join, and explicitly define the join relations here. Right? So I want to join on employee, and I want to join on company. Right? Either approach will yield the same result. Right? So employee, company. Okay, and that gives me the same result. And basically, what I then end up with as my final data set is all of the columns from the top data block, employee, company, the month, and the total. Right, and then all the columns from the bottom data block, the employee, the company, and the average monthly sales, right? And so that gives me my monthly average on the correct row for the corresponding employee and company groups. So for example, Annie and Big Ed's BBQ, wherever we have that combination, that subgroup of Annie's sales to Big Ed's BBQ, we have this average monthly sale, which of course is going to be the same in each instance, right? Because it's the average across all the months for that particular subgroup. So you see it repeated here again and again, and likewise for all of the other averages, they're repeated again and again for each of the appropriate groups. And so what you would do in this case then is of course hide the unnecessary duplicate columns, which would be this one and this one, and then rename this as a monthly average or something like that. All right, so this is again an example of how you can, in a single data block, incorporate different levels of grouping. Here we've in the top data block we grouped at the we grouped by employee, company, and month. So we have data for individual monthly sales, individual monthly totals. In the second data block, we basically averaged across all the months, so we get just a single total for each combination of employee and company. So these are two different levels of grouping, and then we combine them together into a single data set over here by doing a join. So now we have the original, or I guess semi-original monthly sales. For each employee and company, we've got that employee's monthly sales to that company, as well as the average across all months. So what we could do then, just to finish up this example, what we could do then is we could display, rather than having the total and the monthly average, or in addition to having those, we could add another column here that would, for example, give us the percent of monthly average represented by each month here, right? So I could go ahead and press the FX button, create an expression, something like PCT of PCT of AV, percent of monthly average, press OK. And then as the expression here, I would just, this would be type double, and just return something like the total divided by the monthly average, right? Monthly average is that field, right? That's the field that contains the monthly averages that I just renamed. And so what I want to do is I just want to take the total and divide that by the monthly average, and that will give me in decimal form the percent of monthly average, right? And so now I've got this column that without doing this it would have been a little bit tricky to get, but now that I've incorporated all this data together into a single data block, I can compute this column. So it gives me for each month's total what the percentage of the average monthly sales that is, and I can see for a particular month, let's say, I guess this is April 2015, I can see that that's doing better than the average, better than the monthly average, whereas a different month like October 2015 is really way below monthly average. So that's, again, a way to, when you're working with grouped and aggregated data, to incorporate the grouping and aggregated data from different levels of grouping into a single data set. Okay, I will stop there. I did go longer than I thought I would, but I'm not shocked. So let me see if there's any questions on anything that we did today. I'll just wait a moment or two. Again, it is mostly basic stuff, and you'll find all of this in the documentation, but maybe somebody saw something that they hadn't seen before, I hope. So I'll just wait another moment or two, see if there's any questions popping up. I don't see any questions. I guess it was pretty basic. Okay, so well, thank you for listening in any case, and hope to see you back next month. And till then, have a nice weekend and enjoy the spring weather, if it's spring where you are, which probably is. Okay, thanks very much. Take care. Bye-bye.